This is an interview with Fred Dennin, September 20th, 2002, at the New York State Military Museum and Veterans Research Center, Saratoga Springs, New York. September 20th, 2002, I said that, 1:30 p.m. The interviewer is Michael Russert. Could you tell me your full name, date of birth, and place of birth, please?
Frederick S. Dennin, date of birth June 25, 1923, place of birth Canton, New York, St. Lawrence County.
Okay. Could you tell me your pre-war educational experience, please?
Well, I grew up in Lake Placid. I attended Lake Placid High School. I graduated from there in 1941. I had 2 years of college at St. Lawrence University in Canton from 41 to 43 prior to my entry into the military service.
Okay, did you have any jobs before the war at all?
Before the war, I had summer jobs.
Okay.
I caddied from the time I was 11. I delivered special deliveries at the post office, whatever was available.
Okay. Where were you, and what was your reaction to the news about Pearl Harbor?
That was a Sunday afternoon when it was right after I got out of high school and had started college. I was at my grandmother's house. I was born in that home, and I stayed there during my tenure. I did belong to a fraternity, but that's where I stayed. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and I was just resting in the house at that time when that news came on. I knew it was momentous. I knew it necessarily had an effect on my life. I listened to everything. I listened to the president and his speech, and I went to the fraternity house I belonged to, and we talked about it there, and we just knew it would have a significant impact. To what extent and how far it would go, it was rather hard to envision at that time.
Right. Were you drafted or did you enlist?
All right, I enlisted, but I enlisted in an enlisted reserve corps. That dealt generally with people in my category who were in college. That meant that the Army was free to call us up at any time. But until they did, we were free to continue with our studies. I actually finished that year and my second year, which would have been my sophomore year at St. Lawrence, and I was then called up into the infantry. I reported, along with others in my similar category, to Fort Niagara. We were issued infantry gear and what have you, and we were then shipped during the summer of '43 to Fort McClellan, Alabama, for 13 weeks of basic training. My comment on Fort McClellan was that it was very well done. It was summer in Alabama. The cadre were professionals. The officers were professional. It was arduous, but I'm glad I had it. It was tough infantry basic training, and a friend of mine from Lake Placid attended the same time, and both of us said that after that it made military life and what followed from it relatively easier than it certainly would have been without it. I think I was fortunate to get the full basic training at that time. Some went in later when I was in prison camp that did not have the benefit of that, and they were also younger than I. So that pursued that summer. I can't say I liked it, but I respected what they were doing. Remember some interesting episodes. There were some German prisoners of war at Fort McClellan at that time who were from the Africa Corps.
Were there any at Fort Niagara at that time? I know Fort Niagara was used as a field.
It may have, but I didn't see them.
Okay, I was just...
We were Fort Niagara a very short time,
okay.
and then we were taken by train down to Fort McClellan in there. we were starting out the training, close order drill, rifle, bayonet drill. These Germans were very elite soldiers, I'm sure of that. They were the Afrika Korps. They were blonde, husky, and they were really laughing at us as we were out there doing it. They had, a fair amount. They looked very healthy, but you could see that they were the elite soldiers, certainly compared to what I saw later. I concluded the basic training at Fort McClellan, and at that point, they we took tests and what have you, and they put me and most of the others there who had been in college in what they called an Army Specialized Training Program, which was essentially a continuation of college. I was, along with many others from there, was sent to Auburn University, which is also in Alabama, quite near, not too far from Birmingham and in Auburn. Fine college. We were given really soft living compared to what we had been doing. We took over what had been a girls' dormitory. There would have been 2 in each one. There were 4 of us, but the food was good. The teachers were high quality, if anything, perhaps higher. Academics had always, I was strong on academics anyway. The other side of the coin is that we knew we were going to be shipped off soon, and we were having a good time more than you normally would have, because we pretty well knew that was down the road. But I did have some teachers there, what have you, during that winter that I held in high regard. And then in probably May, we were all shipped out, and many of us, including myself, were sent to Indiana and were made part of the 106th Infantry Division, which was at Camp Atterbury, right out about 30 miles from Indianapolis. What they had done there, they had retained the cadre and the officers, but they had shipped out as replacements all of the privates and PFCs, and we were all privates at that time. So we, in effect, filled up the ranks of the privates and PFCs and took over the cadre that were there beforehand. They were fine. They were not the same level as Fort McClellan, Alabama, which was that training center. And the summer was, we had long hikes, and we got into Indianapolis, and we were waiting to be shipped out. The summer went fairly fast. It wasn't that tough after the basic training. In the fall, probably in October, we were shipped out. And we were shipped to Boston for transport overseas. We crossed on the Queen Elizabeth, as a matter of fact, which held, I think, as many as 15,000 troops going over. Other than being crowded, we whiled away our time with crap games or lousy food, so to speak. At that time, it was greasy, but nothing bad at all.
Now, did you go across in a convoy?
No, we didn't. We relied on the speed of the Queen Elizabeth. I remember thinking of that. And we asked about it, and the theory was that that ship was so fast that it could change directions from time to time. The thought did cross my mind, if a German submarine was looking for a target, that would have been a fruitful target. That would have been an ideal one to hit. But one, I didn't have a choice about it, and 2, I had to think they weren't going to risk not just the ship, but 15,000 replacements, plus the whole crew, unless they were reasonably sure that it was, well, very sure, that it was going to make the crossing. But we had no convoy, no protection or anything on the way across. And I think the ship did it many other times, and thank God for myself and others, it always made it. Anyway, we landed in Scotland, which was Edinburgh. We took a train down to it was near Stratford-on-Avon. What did they call it? Sandywell Park. which was a training ground, so to speak. This was the fall of 1944. Again, the weather was typical English weather, but we were having a good time. We could go to town. We'd go to these English huge dances. You know, they'd have these halls. What was it? Oopsie daisy, or your left foot in, your left foot out, doing
Boopsie daisy.
both. Yeah, and I was well trained, and I was attuned to the military life. Well, again, I go back to that McClellan experience. I think that may have had certain similarities with Marine Corps training because they were good. I could tell that at that time. And we stayed there until about the end of November, and then we shipped across the Channel, and I believe we landed at Le Havre, which was flattened. It had been, I think, flattened by our own forces primarily at or around the invasion of Normandy at that time. We went over in a British private sailboat, really, and this channel crossing was remarkably rough for the short one. It was sort of a sailboat, had to have a motor on it too. The one I was on, anyway. It was the only time I got seasick in any traversing of that area. But it was a very rough crossing, and I think that was fairly typical of the channel at that time. Anyway, we landed at Le Havre. We stayed there, that was, I think, on the 2nd of December. We were there a short while. One experience there that had an effect on me. While we were there, we would play football, like we did some at Atterbury, and it was fairly rough. And a fellow that I knew, although not well, was very artistically inclined. He would play a violin, and his temperament or mode seemed to get messed up. He was not himself. I didn't understand it. And they would have us do guard duty. I don't believe there were any Germans near that area because we had to travel quite a while before we pulled into the Siegfried line. And this was one of the first rough experience that I somewhat encountered. But I was doing this guard duty, and I noticed the fellow, it was at night, and I thought he was cleaning his M1 rifle. The M1 rifle was sort of pointed that way, but we've all cleaned M1 rifles and gone through all that in basic. Instead, he put the rifle in his mouth and shot himself at that point when I was right beside him, very close to him. And that was somewhat, oh boys, this is really bothering some people before we've really gotten into an area where you would expect it to. Anyway, but for that, it was in December, they loaded us in 2.5-ton trucks. And we moved across France and Belgium and probably Luxembourg through St. Vith. St. Vith is the last community we were in, and I've been back to it since the war. But then we crossed into Germany at that point, and we were to occupy positions in the Siegfried line, which were pillboxes. Pillboxes may be a misnomer. They were really large, rather comfortable quarters with bunks and that type of thing in it. And this story is interesting because my combat experience wasn't that long. Those quarters were occupied by a veteran, I believe it was an armored division, a New York division that had seen all sorts of combat. And the pillboxes had sort of a long entrance like into them. And they looked very awesome to me. And I said, how did you people capture these things? They looked, he said, oh, it was very simple. And I said, well, please tell me. He said, we'd put a Bangladesh torpedo into the entrance, blow it up, and that's all there was to it. Now, the pillbox that I was in with probably 15 to 20 other people was as far as you could get. The German lines, there was a road. It was a forested area in the Ardennes. There was a road that descended down, and the German lines were down there. we were clearly advised that this was going to be a very quiet sector. And our lines were strung way out. The division, of course, had 3 regiments. I had been into the 423rd. Shortly, I'd been a scout. I'd been a BAR man, that's a Browning automatic rifle. And at the last minute, when they shifted me to the 422nd, where I was in a headquarters company, which is a mortar, and the only sidearm you have is a 45 at that. And at that point, it got very cold. And it stuck in my mind this story about how they occupied and destroyed those pillboxes. And I thought, I'm not so sure it's the smartest thing to be inside that pillbox. So I did talk another soldier into going outside, digging 2 foxholes right on the road. The German lines were right down that road. And taking a bazooka, I don't know whether we had 1 or 2, figuring that if they did choose to come up that road, we were in a better position to do some damage. Now, what follows now is recorded in a book, I believe, which was The Last 100 Days. This was the prelude to the Bulge. Remember, the rest of them are in the pillbox. This fellow and I are out in a foxhole out in front. We dug it. And I heard, and he did too, all sorts of motorized activity that went on into the night. Trucks, just about everything that was making an awful noise and an awful racket down that road. And we reported it. I reported it, and this was reported in an account of mistakes that were made, in effect, in not picking up this intelligence. The company commander, the battalion commander I know came and interviewed me, along with the company commander. I'm not sure the regimental commander came or not, but I dealt with him later. That was a Colonel Devereaux, happened to be his name, who was the regimental commander. I told them most explicitly what I'd heard. They were cynical about it. They said, "Are you sure you weren't hearing recordings?" I said, "My opinion is that I was not, that this was something that I truly had heard." And I remember one of them asked me if I was neurotic. And I'm not. I wasn't. I said, "I'm not neurotic." I think I said I'm probably as least neurotic of most privates in this army at that time. But they reported that, along with a nurse. A Belgian nurse came through that area and saw all the buildup and reported it, and it was largely ignored. It was ignored. It was ignored. So we stayed there a few more days. Then, in the meantime, the Germans had cut through. And we were isolated in that position. So we then left the pillbox and sort of meandered around, and it was real cold. It was in the Ardennes, and it was...
So did you have any winter gear?
No, that was all I had was the regular leather shoes, which were terrible. And I almost lost my toes, but I'll get into that later on. It was a night or 2 out there. Then the colonel got the regiment together, and it was a wooded, high area. And he said, "Now we're going to form a skirmish line of everyone that was there." We had no artillery. It was terribly overcast. There was no air cover. And then we're going to move through these woods in a direction he set forth. And obviously the enemy is out there somewhere. And we did. That time all I had was the sidearm, was the 45, the pistol. We went quite a ways, and it was a full regiment to start with. I went myself and another individual specifically to where a point where the woods stopped, and there was a plain, an open field like a hill, but it was a grassed field that went down to a road, and the road sort of wound around the promontory of the wooded area that we were. There weren't many of us that had come that far, but at the foot of the hill where the road was, all of a sudden it was lined up with Tiger tanks. I heard later that they got screwed up in the German transportation system, which was messed up, and they happened to be coming through. But they were lots of them. and they all had 88s on them, and they all started shelling that particular point I was in right at that point. My companion, I think, was killed. I was struck in the upper thigh, way upper thigh with shrapnel. I was almost, what they call it, an involuntary celibate by the sake of 1 inch at that point. And you don't know how bad you're hurt. You're bleeding. Then the Germans did, that was a fairly long hill. One lone soldier came up with a Schneider pistol. He was a kid, and he wore one of, this is the first, I'd seen a couple of dead Germans back when we were wandering around. But he had what they call a Schneider pistol. I don't think he was over 16 years of age. I was wounded, and he was coming up to get whoever was in there out at that point. So he was taking some risks, but there were very few of our soldiers there. The fellow beside me, I believe, was dead. So I did go out with my hands up at that point. He was stabbing me with the Schneider pistol and motioning. What he wanted me to do was to go back in the woods, because they were still shelling the woods. And, I looked at him and I looked at the woods, and I managed to get back in there. And then I went up I dragged myself up about another 50 yards, and another German soldier was coming up, an older one. And I limped out, surrendering to him, and he was great to me. We carried these sulfa packs with us. He treated the wounds at that time, at least with the sulfa, and helped me get down to the foot of the hill. Now, at that point, I was put in a barn with other wounded people, many of whom were very seriously wounded, many of whom died that night. It was bitter cold, and I'm not really blaming the Germans. I think it's probably all they had. And my own experience with the German military, where I was more fortunate to deal with, was that they did not treat me in what I considered civilians. I could say something different, and perhaps I will, but they were all right with us. Then the next day, they marched us out, and my feet were terribly frozen, you're right. But they marched us to a hospital train, we that were wounded and were still living, and we were put on the hospital train. We were put on the hospital train with German wounded, German nurses, German doctors, and we were treated there just the same as they are. That's when my feet had turned black, and they had to cut the boots. And they were black, they're split. The big toe especially will split. They talked of some amputation. I didn't want it done, and they went along with what I had wanted done, and it worked out because I did save my feet, and I really had nothing special in the way of foot problem. That really was a blessing to me in many ways, because even though I was wounded, I did not have to walk out of that area. And with the foot problems I'd had, that would have been exceedingly difficult because it was brutally cold, and the ones that did do that took long walks. We came to, then they did let me off at a prisoner of war camp on Christmas Eve, which was, I believe, near Hamburg. I was in 2 prisoner of war camps, 11B and 2A, and I think this one was 2A. It was a huge one. There were some Russian prisoners there whose lot was terrible. There were quite a few. We were put generally with American prisoners. There were displaced people. We oddly enough got in there Christmas Eve in a mess, although my trip in the hospital was not that bad. And they actually gave us a piece of steak that night, it being Christmas Eve, which surprised me. I stayed there until early in January. It was a huge motley place, cold, but you're in bunks, and the food was terrible, but they didn't have that much themselves. Then, around the 10th of January, when it was bitter cold, they shipped us out. And this is an interesting story here. We were loaded into, it was about the 9th or 10th of January. We were loaded into freight cars. They were unheated. The door was then locked. There were no sanitary facilities. They gave us a loaf of bread and, I believe, a little water. They then locked the door. It was January of 45, and history tells me that it was one of the coldest Januaries they'd ever had. It took us probably 5 days to complete that route. The sanitary conditions, the food was terrible. There was just straw in there. And at one point, and this is quite interesting, the whole train was stopped. And we were laying or trying to sit against the wall. And we were strafed then by one of our own aircraft. I believe it was a P-47, which carries 8 50 caliber machine guns, which are almost like 8 Canton. Mm-hmm. It's interesting. The first, strafing flight he took, we did not hear the plane, but the machine guns went off like 8 Canton, and then he made 2 or 3 more passes. He did not hit our car. He hit cars further down, where there were all sorts of casualties. Then that's the last. The strafing stopped. The Germans then did open a door and gave us some water and pointed to what they said was a shot-down aircraft over in a field alongside of it. It was somewhat surprising, but it was possible. It's hard for me to tell what type of anti-aircraft activity they had there, but the strafing did stop. It was very scary. Then you could hear the plane come down when it was going through it, whether it wasn't marked or those things happened at that time. Anyway, the people I was within, we were okay on that. Now then we came to, where was it I got to? There were 2 places. There was a city, and it was Rostok. Yeah, Rostok was in East Germany, up near the Baltic Sea it was. And at Rostok, we were unloaded from the boxcar for the first time, and we walked through the streets of Rostok. We were a very sorry-looking outfit at that time. The civilians, they jeered at us and yelled at us and screamed at us and what have you, but they did not molest us physically at that time. We then walked to a prison camp, and this one, I believe, was 11B, which again was a large one. And there was a book written about it, Stalag 11B, about a person who was taken prisoner in North Africa, but it happened to be an American. And he wrote a book about his stay in Stalag 11B. There, the food there was little or nothing, but we did get, if we were fortunate, some Red Cross parcels. And the American government, the problem was, and one of the problems was the Germans didn't have any food at this particular point. And I believe the deal was made that through the auspices of the Red Cross, they would agree that these Red Cross parcels would be delivered. In theory, you were to get one a week. You wouldn't get one a week. There were all sorts of, but they were a lifesaver. And it's an interesting side note. I had never smoked before then, and never have since, but they would send 5 packs of cigarettes, Camel cigarette, very powerful. And it always, and I would trade those for food. Invariably. Later on, I saw a person starve himself to death almost to get those cigarettes in a follow-up there. I wasn't in this place too long. There was some great, where I was Americans, although I ran into some British prisoners who were also in the same place I was, who had been prisoners almost since way back in the war, when conditions were, as far as certain types of treatment, I think much worse. I tended to admire them. They were very independent, self-reliant. They would never bother your goods or anything, and not when you better not do theirs. sometimes with the most recent recruits, or the ones that came in the recent replacements, who were only 18 or so at that time. Remember, I say I was only 21, but 21's a little older than an 18-year-old, and I was going on 22. And I'd had the advantage of more time and that really excellent basic training in that spot. I was there a good deal of January, and then a surprising thing happened. I was picked out, or my number was drawn for some reason or other, because they could work privates in PFCs. Non-coms weren't supposed to. And there was a small work group between Rostok and Stettin. They were both on the Baltic Sea, which was on the estate of a German, call him a squire, call him a baron. He also was high up in the Gestapo at that point. And he maintained this beautiful estate where the deer ran free, and it was beautifully forested. And this work group of probably 25 to 30 people worked those grounds for him. When I first got there, you would go out with a crew. There was an old German sergeant named Brown who had once spent time in the United States, who had been on the Russian front, and we all loved him. He knew it was coming to an end. He spoke pretty good English, but we worked under civilian overseers, and they were rough. We would plant trees. You'd get in a line, and you'd go so far, and you'd plant a tree, and then go on. And we called this German over. He was a Prussian, and they were tough people up in that agricultural area. And I know we called him Old 400 because he reminded us of a train that some of the prisoners had been there longer than I. Remember, I was only picked out to fill the place of one person who had died, and they wanted to fill that group. I actually had a German guard take me on a German train to there and walk with me to that particular small camp that night. And another interesting coincidence in that small group was a fellow named Joe Schuba, who, oddly enough, had gone to St. Lawrence with me before the war. We had never met at St. Lawrence. He was 1 year ahead of me there, and he was in the theologue school, and I wasn't. But we became quite friendly there, and we probably had more college and more education than the ones that they had happened to have filling that area. Anyway, I got a bad back injury there because they had us planting trees, and I'd fallen off a 2.5-ton truck, catching my foot on the gate. And while I was planting the trees going along, it acted up terribly. But fortunately, it recovered enough so that I even went back. They put me back to work. Now, about this time, it was approaching spring. It would have been in April, probably quite early in April, and then before long we were not far from Stettin. We were hearing the Russian artillery. And one thing I remember so well, it was as though it's going to come to an end. The weather turned nice all of a sudden. And I always remember we were not working one day, and we came back with Brown escorting us, and this young schoolgirl came along, was probably 8 or 9 years old, and she said, "Heil Hitler!" She went. Poor old Brown just ignored her completely. And oddly enough, I knew some French. I was the only one who knew some French because I'd had some more in high school than college. But when you are using it, and the French prisoners had far more freedom than we did. So again, there was a lot of barter going on, those cigarettes. And therefore, I became the person who did a lot of the bartering because the French that were near us could speak French, but their English was very poor. And I remember doing most of the trading and what have you at that time. And I remember something else that was interesting. In all of these Red Cross parcels, they would give you a can of powdered milk, which in my judgment, they had candy bars and you had other things, but I always felt the powdered milk probably, so I was always trading cigarettes for these cans of powdered milk, and they were always, I picked up the nomer or misnomer of the sweet milk kid at that time. Now, one other fascinating thing that happened there, one time the guards came, and we had some officer guards, but it was always Brown who walked us out. And they said the Gauleiter or the squire or whoever was in charge would like to see you. And of course, we were always told you only tell your name, rank, and serial number. And everyone said, oh, you shouldn't go anywhere. So I don't know anything. And perhaps I was curious. I said, I have no information of an intelligence area that could possibly serve an area, so I'll go. And I was escorted really this palatial out, and manner-like, and he was as educated and smooth and spoke perfect English, offered me a cup of tea, which I took. He thought I was German nationality. My name was Frederick, and at that point I had the short haircut I'd had not worn off, and he really was inquiring why I was over here fighting the fatherland or trying to get a feel on that type of thing. I did indicate him that especially the course that their leader was taking, who was Adolf Hitler, and I'd seen this, and his treatment of all sorts of minorities, especially the Jewish people, which I had personally seen, was something that the civilized world could not endure. And therefore I felt that it was an evil that was part of my responsibility to be involved in. He took no offense at that, which was surprising. Had me escorted back, thanked me very much, to my quarters, which an anomalous thing I heard after when the Russians were in that area that they had executed him. Now, I'm not sure that was so. Anyway, there came a time in April, which was a beautiful day, and the guns were going, that Brown and ourselves, and there may have been another one or two, but Brown is the one that sticks in my mind, said, why don't we all head westward? Our lines are that way. And the Germans especially would much rather be captured by the Allied forces than the Russians, and for good reason, as I'll tell you later at that point. So I always remember it was a bright sunny day, and we started out, and we're headed westward, and I took out a cigarette and smoked it, and they all couldn't believe it. I didn't inhale it, I never did, but they all couldn't believe I was smoking that cigarette. Well, we walked for most of that day, and we came to the Oder River, and the port was Peenemünde. The story gets very interesting now. At Peenemünde, there was the rocket base where the German V-2 rocket was developed. So we got down to the river, which was not too far from the estuary going out into the sea, and there was one small ferry boat taking everyone across, and you had displaced persons in their striped uniforms all over. You had German military women in uniforms changing to get out of the uniforms. They were all deathly fearful of the Russians. As we waited to see if we'd ever get across, on the other side of the river, a whole phalanx of American 2.5-ton trucks came tearing up. And we thought it was our forces at first blush on that side. But it wasn't. It was the Russian forces under Rokossovsky, I believe it was. And they all had machine guns on the back, and they were shooting and killing and what have you with everything. We were with some French prisoners at that time. They were staying in that area, and they invited us to come back while all this mayhem was going on and stay with them, which would be a rather secure place. Again, there were probably 25 of us, the same group that had left that area. And we did go back there, and we stayed there that night. The following morning, it might have been the second morning, but I think it was the following morning, Shuba and I ventured outside, and it was quiet. And then we walked, and very shortly we came to where the headquarters at Peenemünde were for the offices of where all the paperwork was done for this rocket base. There was no one there. No one there. We actually went inside, and papers were thrown all over and destroyed, and as though they were trying to do something, but whether the Russians hadn't actually gone quite that far or what, there was no one there. We left, and then we came to, it had to be a dam or a concrete fixture which went out into the Oder River right near where it went into the sea. And out on that were a whole flock of bicycles that had just been left there. My friend went out first. He thought maybe we would get a bicycle or something. Then all of a sudden a Russian did appear a few hundred yards away and fired at him. And may have fired at me. He said he heard the trajectory go right over his head. Well, we made a quick exit from there. We went back to the place where we were, and we tried to talk the rest of them into going back and getting these bicycles the next day, and then cycling as a group westward, assuming we could get across the river. But they didn't want to do it. Except one. Schuba said one went with us, and my memory is fuzzy. It was always my recollections of Schuba during these next few days as being together. And I remember Schuba was, one thing he said to him, if you stay here, the Russians are going to have you burying dead horses. And he ran into one later, and that's exactly what they did have him doing. You were there, Helen, I think, because I got together with Schuba after the war. Anyway, we did go out, and the bicycles were still there. And we got the bicycles. We bicycled back to that spot where we were going to take the ferry over. The Russians at that point were on both sides. They were mostly Tartars and Mongols. You'll read of Rokossovsky's army in northeastern Germany being sent there almost purposefully to treat the Germans very, very rigorously, and they did. And they did. They were pretty good to us. Either they had our equipment or Amerikansky, you got as good treatment as anything. Anyway, the long and short of it is that we got across on a small ferry. The Russians were there. We started traveling on the bikes along the road westward to where we understood our lines were. We did see atrocities. I ran into German military who were just run over by tanks purposefully. I saw several instances of rape along the side of the road. We would come to a German farmhouse, and they saw we were Americans, and they would beg us to stay over, because if we were around, they knew the Russians would not bother them. But otherwise, they were in a terrible situation. I'm sure there were parts of Russia they treated those people the same way. But it was a terrible thing to see. With the Russian army, they would, they'd go into a pub or a place there, and they'd bring out the liquor. They were always drinking. And we drank some too, and ate more than we'd ever eaten before. And one very interesting story, we then seemed to lose the Russians. We're in sort of a no man's area, headed toward the Allied lines, which were at, it's on the Elbe at Lübeck. That's the name. It's where we were headed for. And so we're bicycling into this German town from the east, and the mayor comes out in a high black hat. And all of the townspeople there cheering us. They thought they were American Army coming in. They were going to be liberated. Because we still had our uniforms on, although I did not have a helmet and that type of thing. Well, we disillusioned them rather rapidly and went on. I think we, at that time, did have drinks and food with some Russian people that were sacking that town and what have you in at a pub in sort of an area. But be that as it is, we then did proceed. And just before Lübeck was intended to be in the Russian zone under, I believe it was the Potsdam Agreement, but it was occupied by a British unit of the First Army who had gone further than they were supposed to have, so we suddenly came to where the Russian road ended, and it was British from that point on. They were allowing no one across that zone. The Russians weren't at all. Like you could see, they were not there. However, they did allow us across, being Americans. And to an extent, that's where we went to Lubeck. Lubeck had been in German hands until very recently. I noted one instance, war is tough. A sniper had just been holed out up in a tower and had killed several Allied soldiers, and I was there when they executed the sniper at that time. Meanwhile, we were eating the British mess kits and what have you, and I suddenly, fortunately it didn't happen earlier, got terribly sick to my stomach. It was just the sudden food, and that's where I lost Shuba, because I was terribly sick. But I was very fortunate. They put me in a military hospital. The treatment was lining your stomach with chalk, feeding you reasonably well. And I was in with prisoners who were wounded and in far worse condition than I was. So I only stayed there a day or two. And then they flew me back to Brussels in one of those cargo planes. We were put up in wonderful quarters in Brussels, which had been occupied by German officers before. We were given $20 a day to be applied toward back pay, which they never caught up with us on. They gave me all my back pay. It wasn't much. I was only private, but it seemed like quite a bit that time. And Brussels was a lovely, wonderful city to be in, and it was in May it was in May. Yeah, it was well into May by that time. It must have been close to June. I got in Lubeck around VE Day. And I stayed in Brussels probably 10 days or so. And then they took us over to London. And we were given a place in London to stay. And I ran into some of my initial comrades, both at Auburn and in Fort McClellan, Alabama. Two of them in particular, I remember. Joe, you remember the Jewish fellow that Joe? Yeah, he ended up in California. Joe, he lived in the Bronx. I ran into him and another fellow. His name will come to me, not Lieberman, something like that, though. Could have been Lieberman. Be that as it is, it was interesting there. We were invited out to an English country estate. They were just interested in meeting us, and we had helped them in the war, and I admired the British people very much. And that was a fascinating experience. There were many Canadian soldiers there that weekend. And you could see the changes in the government coming. The Labour Party was about to win the election. There was some strong feelings about the American Navy and their Navy and which was superior. And I probably said, I think we probably have the more powerful Navy out there at that time. But some of them were very, very nice, and we played golf, even though I'm a terrible golfer, on their course. And it was really a fascinating experience. From there, we went back to London. They shipped us back to the States, including a couple that I had known way back, which just by coincidence. And we shipped back on a merchant, one of those Liberty ships, but because the war was over in Europe, we took the gun crew's quarters. And again, the food was excellent. The trip across was uneventful. We landed in New York that night. We bar hopped and what have you, and reminisced that night. And then an interesting finale to the story is, I was then given a 90-day furlough. All prisoners of war at that point were given a 90-day furlough. I happened to live in Lake Placid. This was around the 1st of July. It was right before the 4th, as I recall. So I was ordered to report to Lake Placid at the end of the 90 days because they maintained a rehab center up there, where the soldiers that had had the 90-day furloughs, who oftentimes were prisoners of war, but not necessarily, or severely wounded, would then report for whatever their destiny was to be from that point on. So that summer, I was at my home. I got back a little later than some of the others, so many of the buddies that I knew were coming through Lake Placid at that facility at that time. And we got to renew acquaintances. Again, it was a ball, so to speak. The word was, and I do follow history quite a bit, the word was that we were planning on being shipped west then for the invasion of Japan. And in fact, during that course of my summer there, when we dropped the atom bomb on Nagasaki and then on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, I remember discussing it with a rather learned man who was staying in my father's house, and he really saw the consequences of what this was going to be. But I recall my immediate reaction was, as horrible as it is, it's going to end the war, which it did. And the invasion of Japan was, even I knew at that point, was not going to be a picnic, and I've since ascertained from my study of history that those were the intents, and they had envisioned tremendous casualties if they hadn't gone that route. Be that as it is, it was a wonderful summer. I was very fortunate to have met my wife that summer, who was working up there at that time and staying at my own house. And at the fall, you give you points that enabled you to get out. I was, I think, 5 points shy because my length of service wasn't quite enough, so they sent me up to Pine Camp for a month, at which time I would have the points at that point. When the war was over, they shut down the rehab center at Lake Placid just about the time that I went through it, and I came back. My wife and I, Helen, were engaged at that time. She had moved back to Rome, and at that point I entered directly into law school under the GI Bill, and the rest of it is different history. That's about it.
So you used the GI Bill?
Oh, yes. Yes, the GI Bill was very generous to me. I was able to get through law school in 2 years' time because we went in the summer. Remember, I'd had 2 years of college before the war. My academics were strong. Mm-hmm. And the GI, even after I went there, we tried New York for a while. And I took graduate work at NYU in tax law. And one of my motivations was because you were working for nothing in New York, is that they were paying us some maintenance at NYU, and I had some wonderful teachers in tax law on that. And I tried that for a year, and then we were married while I was in law school. I then returned to Lake Placid to set up to practice law with an older lawyer who was sort of a gentleman's lawyer who didn't have much practice. We had 2 kids, no car. I was on a $25 a week drawing account for a period of time, and I owed him $1,000, and then everything turned good, at least as far as my career and everything else was, things. I had a good law career, I had a good business career, and I was very blessed from every point of view, and I, in many ways, consider the war a rewarding experience for me. I tended to feel that I was a survivor, mm-hmm. and I think the lessons I learned there, also learned some foolishness there, but having said all that, I do think that the overall experience and the early years I had, and the training I had, and the life I had before, in sum total was a real positive thing as far as our life and my life, what have you, are concerned. Mm-hmm. Okay. So I really felt that in many ways the Army did me a favor. But I also learned that I could survive in others had it infinitely worse than I did, don't get me wrong. I'd much rather have been a prisoner in Germany than Japan, by far. But having said that, it was no picnic. Actually, the ones that stayed in that prison camp, remember I said I was left and pulled out, they had to walk. I think within a day or two, in that book I told you, Stalag 11B, they pulled everyone out and made them walk in the winter westward at that point, and they had a tough one. I'd much rather have been in the work group, mm-hmm. doing what I did and did the walking when we did, mm-hmm. in April, at that point.
How much time is it? Okay. Do you belong to any veterans groups? Did you join any veterans groups?
Oh, I belong to the American Legion, and I probably belong to the XPO. I belong to the XPOWs. I've been somewhat active in the Legion, but I would not call myself a tremendously active one.
And his picture.
Yeah, that's right. I was in. They took my picture on the Legion parade, standing up there. I didn't know they were taking it. It was the best picture I ever had taken. I look remarkably young. I was surprised.
One question, or one thing you mentioned, you said you knew, or you said you saw something about the treatment of the Jewish prisoners, or?
Oh, yes. Yeah,
Where was that?
yeah. Going through the cities, you would see these horrid signs, Juden with the large nose. When we were ready to cross the river, what concentration inmates were left, many of whom were Jewish, were emaciated and could hardly walk. It was the attitude in the cities and the ones I actually saw there. I was never actually in a concentration camp, but I did see the inmates of the concentration camp at that stage of the war. And I saw the propaganda, which was every time we would go through a city, which was tremendously pointed toward making them victims, demonizing them in every possible way. The only time I probably saw another interesting one, when I hit this first prison camp I told you near Hamburg, and then we were going through an inspection. And we used to have in the States, it was a genital inspection and what have you. And I thought they were checking to see if I was Jewish, which, one, I wasn't, and two, I was never circumcised. So I said, I'll show them. I couldn't be. Instead, they were checking for lice, which incidentally I did catch only toward the end.
Really?
And then I was immediately doused by the Allied forces. I was fortunate that it got me near the end. And then, of course, they were in a position to clear it up.
Okay, well, you answered, I was going to ask about how the war affected your life, but you answered all those.
It was positive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I always felt that it was positive. Hmm.
Okay. Well,
And,
thank
and I always felt very fortunate that I got out of it as well as I did. And the GI Bill was very helpful to me. I've also paid the government back a lot in taxes for sending me there. So I have paid
Well,
for
you were a
it.
tax lawyer.
Well, no, but I pay income taxes.
Yes.
Significant.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for the interview.
Well, you're welcome, Mike.
I wanted to ask you one question. Do you have any wartime photographs of yourself in uniform or anything?
I have one in uniform.
Would you mind
I'll send
getting
it
a
down.
copy of it?
I have several
Can you
copies of
put
it.
in,
Yeah, I have several
in your
copies.
folder?
It's one I had when I came home on furlough after I was in basic training. I looked very young then, but I do have that one.
Okay, great. And maybe you could do a copy of that article where you
Yeah.
were.
Yeah.
Oh, that was a good picture.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, that was a good picture. I was standing alongside a Korean War
A
veteran,
year ago,
and I actually looked younger than he did because I had the hat on, the Legion hat.
he spoke at the Veterans Day service, and the local media, there was not one bit of coverage, not a soul there. Well, somebody must have put them on notice, and so this year they covered it well, but it was Fred and one other, unbeknown to them.
We were saluting the colors at that time. It was a great picture. I never knew they took it. That's, as I said, probably why it was great.
You have the address here to send.
Yeah, I do. Yeah, I have it.
Okay.